Imagine conquering half a continent and then discovering that conquest itself has to be paid for. Every occupying soldier needs food, every factory needs fuel, every train needs coal, every army needs weapons, and weapons need workers to build them. So the real question isn't just how Nazi Germany took control of most of Europe, it's how it tried to make the very people and land it conquered pay for the war that conquered them. By the early 1940s, Germany controlled territory stretching from the Atlantic coast to deep into Eastern Europe on a map that looked like overwhelming strength. But behind the map was a much harder problem. War on this scale was staggeringly expensive, and Germany's own economy could not cover the bill alone. So occupation authorities turned outward, toward the economies of the countries they now controlled, their money, their food, their factories, their workers. On paper, this looked like a solution. In reality, it was the beginning of a system that would eventually strain itself to the breaking point. But money was only the beginning of the problem. Who actually pays for an occupying army? In Nazi-occupied Europe, the answer was usually the occupied country itself. Germany imposed so-called occupation costs on many territories it controlled, payments framed as covering the expense of the German military presence, but which historians generally agree far exceeded any reasonable accounting of that cost. Alongside these charges came requisitioning, forced exchange rates that favored Germany, and financial arrangements that funneled resources back toward Berlin. This wasn't ordinary taxation, where a government spends revenue on its own citizens. This was a one-way transfer, extracted under military occupation, with little regard for what the local economy could actually sustain. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If money can be extracted this aggressively, how long before the underlying economy starts to buckle? Because an occupied economy isn't an inexhaustible account to draw from, and even an enormous financial transfer could not feed an army. Soldiers don't run on currency, they run on food. And a modern army spread across an entire continent needed agricultural output on a massive scale: grain, meat, and produce. Much of it drawn directly from the occupied territories where those soldiers were stationed. In some regions, particularly in the East, agricultural policy was explicitly designed to prioritize German military and civilian needs over the survival needs of the local population. This wasn't simply inefficiency or wartime shortage. In certain occupied areas, requisitioning food for Germany and the occupying forces directly contributed to hunger, and in specific cases, to mass starvation among civilians, a human catastrophe layered on top of an economic strategy. That distinction matters. Extracting food was a deliberate economic choice, and the suffering that followed was its direct human consequence, not a side effect anyone could reasonably claim was unforeseen. A system that removes more food from an economy than that economy can replace doesn't just weaken people. It begins consuming its own future, because starving, exhausted populations cannot keep farms and cities running indefinitely. But food was only one part of the machine. The factories were even more valuable. Money can be printed. Food can, in theory, be requisitioned again next season. But an industrial base, steel mills, coal mines, machine tool factories, railway workshops, takes years to build. Germany didn't have years to spare, so it moved to absorb the industrial capacity it had already conquered. Occupied regions in France, Belgium, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere had significant industrial infrastructure, and German authorities and private German companies worked to redirect that capacity toward the war effort, producing steel, machinery, vehicle parts, and military equipment. Some of this involved formal state direction, some involved coercive arrangements with existing firms, some involved outright seizure of resources and enterprises from occupied populations, including the confiscation of Jewish-owned businesses and property as part of the broader machinery of persecution. The common thread was control. Occupied industry increasingly served German military production, which fed the war effort, which demanded still more territory and resources to sustain. But running factories at full capacity required something Germany was rapidly losing: enough workers to staff them. Total war creates a strange contradiction. The more soldiers a country sends to the front, the fewer workers remain at home to build the weapons those soldiers need. Millions of German men were serving in the military, and that left farms, mines, construction sites, and factories short-handed at precisely the moment demand for their output was climbing. Germany's response was to pull labor from occupied territories on an enormous scale. Some workers went voluntarily, drawn by wages or promises of employment. But a large proportion did not go voluntarily. Forced labor programs compelled millions of people from occupied countries and, in the most extreme and murderous form, concentration camp prisoners, to work under brutal conditions, often with inadequate food, shelter, and safety, and with little regard for their survival. This was not simply an economic policy. It was a system built on coercion, cruelty, and in its most extreme applications, deliberate dehumanization and mass death. Even judged purely as economics, forced labor carried a hidden cost. It was often less productive than free labor, and it devastated the very populations Germany depended on to keep occupied economies functioning. But even when workers, food, and factories all existed, one problem remained: moving everything to where it was actually needed.
Resources don't do anything sitting in a warehouse or a field. They have to move by rail, by road, by ship, to the factories, the front lines, and the cities that need them. And Europe's transportation networks, especially its railways, were under enormous strain. Military transport took priority. Troops, tanks, artillery, and fuel had to move first. That meant civilian and even economic freight, coal, grain, raw materials, was routinely delayed or displaced. As the war ground on, Allied bombing campaigns increasingly targeted railway lines, bridges, and marshalling yards, and partisan and resistance activity in several occupied regions further disrupted transport. The problem was no longer simply finding a resource. The problem was moving it faster than the front line could consume it. An empire that controls a coal mine on paper but cannot get that coal to a steel mill hasn't really gained anything at all. This is where the deeper pattern comes into focus. On the surface, territorial expansion looked like an economic multiplier. More land meant more farmland, more factories, more workers, more raw materials. But every new territory also came with new costs. Each occupied region needed troops to secure it, administrators to run it, and infrastructure to maintain it, all while its transportation networks had to be integrated into an already strained system. So expansion created a paradox. More territory meant more potential resources, but more territory also meant more occupation costs, more security demands, and more logistical burden. Was conquest actually making Germany richer? Or was it simply making the machine larger, hungrier, and more expensive to run? The further the empire stretched, the harder that question became to answer in Germany's favor. By the war's later years, the pressures inside this system were compounding. Military defeats meant shrinking territory, which meant a shrinking resource base at the exact moment demands were highest. Fuel shortages slowed both military operations and industrial production. Allied bombing damaged factories, railways, and infrastructure across occupied and German territory alike. Labor shortages deepened as more men were pulled into the military, and as forced labor systems, brutal and unsustainable, began to break down the very populations they depended on. In several occupied countries, resistance movements sabotaged rail lines and industrial output, adding friction to an already overstretched system. None of this, on its own, brought down Nazi Germany. The collapse was ultimately military, political, and strategic as much as economic. But the economic strain was real, and it reveals something important. Extraction can generate enormous resources in the short term, but extraction without renewal eventually damages the very foundation it depends on. The occupied territories were never an infinite bank account. They were real economies, with real limits on food, on labor, on fuel, on factories, on rail lines that could only carry so much before something broke. Nazi Germany could extract enormous resources from the lands it controlled, but every act of extraction created new damage and new costs, on top of catastrophic human suffering that this system was built upon and could never justify. The larger the system grew, the harder it became to sustain. In the end, conquest expanded far faster than any empire could actually absorb, and a war machine that consumes its own foundation is already counting down to its own collapse.